When you think about the book of Exodus, there's probably a few specific things, persons and places and events that come to mind. Moses is probably something that comes to mind. The Exodus from Egypt and the Passover that happens around that time. Maybe you think about the law being given at Mount Sinai and the Ark of the Covenant being constructed. There's a lot of big moments that happen in the second book of the Bible. But what if I told you that Jesus himself, the second personification of God, the second way in which God, of three ways in which God presents himself, that Jesus, for lack of a better name, is all over the book of Exodus? That you can find him peppered throughout that book in various persons, places, and things being presented to the Old Testament reader. For example, the person of Moses is a representation of Jesus himself. Now, that's not to say Moses is not a real person. He was. But it's just that the life that Moses lived was lived in such a way as to reflect the glory and the life that Jesus himself would live someday in the future. For example, Moses was a person born under difficult circumstances. The Pharaoh was putting Hebrew boys to death all over the land of Egypt. And so when Moses was born, being a boy, the law said he should have been thrown into the river. But instead he was protected and cared for and sent away so that his life could be spared. Jesus too was a child who was born during a time, or soon after his birth, was a time when his life and the lives of any potential baby boy was in jeopardy, as King Herod was looking for the Messiah and was prepared to kill any baby boy that he could find that might be the Messiah. So Jesus and Moses have that connection. Likewise, Jesus is a person who presented a law to his people and offered a new way to live before God. Moses, before him, presented a law to the people and offered a new way to live with God as their God. Before that, the law was given. The children of Israel were in captivity, and it was Moses whom God raised up to be the deliverer of the people and the savior of the people, just like we were in captivity to sin, and God raised Jesus, proverbially and literally, to be our savior and to free us and redeem us and rescue us from spiritual bondage. So they go to Sinai, they get the law, just like we go to our spiritual mountaintop and get our law from Christ. And the children of Israel continue to go through the wilderness on their way to the promised land. And if you remember, in Exodus chapter 16, the people are hungry and they're begging and they're crying for food, and God rains manna down from heaven. Jesus uses that historical account, and he draws a connection to himself by saying, I am the bread of life. I am the manna. Your fathers, your ancestors, in John chapter 6, he says this, ate manna in the wilderness and are now dead. But I can give you a manna that if you eat it, you will never die. You'll live forever. And that's, of course, the spiritual manna of salvation. Speaking of bread, even before that, you have the Passover. That's another connection to Jesus. In order to leave Egypt, God sent plague after plague after plague to harden Pharaoh's heart, culminating in the last plague, the death of all the firstborn sons in Egypt. But, of course, the Hebrews could be spared. Anyone, in fact, could be spared, as long as they would sacrifice a perfect lamb and cover their doorposts and the mantle of the house with the blood of this lamb. That blood and that lamb and that covering represents Jesus Christ, our perfect lamb, who sacrificed his life and shed his blood so that we could be covered in it, and then God's judgment would pass over us and spare us from the death we deserve. So over and over you find connection to Jesus. Even in Exodus chapter 17, which if you're just reading it for the first time, you might blow right by and not think anything of it. The context of Exodus 17 is the children of Israel are thirsty. They were hungry in 16, they're thirsty in 17. They're thirsty and they're crying and they're complaining. And God says to Moses, here's what you're going to do. You're going to find this big rock in Horeb, and you're going to strike it with your staff. And when you strike it, it will spew out water for all the people to drink. And sure enough, that's exactly what Moses does. He strikes the rock with his staff, and out comes water to provide for the people. Paul, in 1 Corinthians 10, reminds us of that rock that gave the people water. And he says that rock was Christ. Not literally, Jesus is not a person made of rocks, but it is representational. Just like when you take the fruit of the vine, or when you take the unleavened bread in the Lord's Supper. It's not really Jesus' body and really Jesus' blood. It is representational. Well, that rock was representational. Paul makes that connection for you because when that rock gave forth water, it provided for the people so that they might live. Jesus was a spiritual rock that was struck in his crucifixion, and out came his water, his living water, so that we who drink of it might live forever. All over Exodus, you see the Messiah. You see him in the form of Moses. You see him in the form of the Passover lamb. You see him in the form of the manna. You see him in the form of the rock that provided water. All over is Jesus. He's all over the whole Old Testament. That's just one book. Next time we'll talk about Leviticus, and we'll see how Jesus can be found all over that book as well.